This episode, I'm joined by author and literary critic Stephen Moore to discuss the life and work of William Gaddis. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible, and if you'd like to support the podcast and keep everything running as it runs off patronage alone, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Steve Moore, thanks very much for joining us on Midix podcast.
Sure, I'm glad to be here.
We are going to be discussing the work of William Gaddis, who was an American novelist, American writer, primarily known for two books, though he wrote 5 and then a collection of essays and now a republished collection of letters. But I would say he's primarily known for the Recognitions and JR, and you don't hear as much about Carpenter's Gothic, Frolic of His Own, or Agape Agape. So you are sort of, dare I say it, the original Gaddis scholar. So before we jump in with Gaddis, just tell us a little bit about yourself, what it is you do, and when it was you first came across Gaddis's work, and why it interested you so much to then go on to become, to write multiple books on Gaddis's work.
Okay, well, at age 72, I've got a lot to cover, but let's see. I originally wanted just to be a history teacher. Then I switched to English when I went to college. I got a degree in MA in 1974. Couldn't find a teaching job, but at that point I was delighted with Joyce, James Joyce. I was just a great fan of his work, and I liked reading the criticism about him. And I'd always had a writing zen, so I thought I'd like to start writing maybe literary criticism like that. I saw what those critics were doing, and I said, I want to join that club. I want to be one of them. And I started writing and publishing a few little things on Joyce in '76. But the year before, 1975. I stumbled across this unknown writer named William Gaddis. I had just idly read a review in my father's Time magazine of JR, which had come out in October of 1975, and there was a sidebar on the Recognitions, which had been reprinted in paperback the year before, and the person compared it to Joyce's Ulysses, which of course was music to my ears. He said it's sort of the closest America's ever produced to Ulysses. So that got me going. I tracked down a copy, I read it, and I realized it's not quite Ulysses, but it's just an incredible novel. Just blew me over. So at that point, I didn't immediately start working on Gaddis, but I started thinking that it might be better to, instead of being the 100th person to write a book on Joyce, maybe the first person to write on Gaddis. But along about that time, I started getting into bookselling, which has been a part of my life. I started working at a small bookstore in Denver. That's where I lived, a suburb of Denver. Then I borrowed some money from my father, opened up my own store, and during that period, I wrote my first book on Gaddis, which is a reader's guide to the Recognitions, based on some Joycean similar reference books. Just identifying all the allusions, annotations, all that kind of stuff. The Recognitions is a very erudite book, and I felt it required that sort of thing. So that was published in 1982. I decided at that point to go back to college, see if I can get a PhD and become a professor. So I spent the 80s at Rutgers mostly, but that didn't work out. By the time I got my PhD, I couldn't even get an interview, much less a job. So I drifted into publishing for a small press called Dalkey Archive. Stayed there until about 1996. Quit because I couldn't stand working for the guy anymore that ran the place. Got back into bookselling with the Borders bookstore chain, which I assume you guys know about that in England.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So started at one of the stores, worked my way up I went to the main office, became one of the buyers until right before the chain went bankrupt. And ever since then, I've been supporting myself as a freelance book indexer, mostly for university presses. So I'm basically a bookman. I've been a bookseller, I've been a book editor, I've been an author of several books, a book reviewer, a book collector. So that's the quick overview of my life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. A life in books, which is very
exactly
very Gaddisian. I mean, his books are absolutely rife with encyclopedic references to everything and everything. I mean, there's a great irony there. I mean, sort of jumping right into the deep end already here, but there's a great irony there of, you know, that early recognition in Gaddis's work of this idea of the recognitions being or Gaddis's work being Joycean, which he then goes on to sort of deny, and actually in quite a long description state what Joyce he's read, which isn't all that much. I mean, just out of interest, I mean, from those early days, where do you stand on that question of the Gaddis-Joyce connection?
Yeah, it's very superficial. I mean, they're both long books. They're both rather challenging, rather difficult in one sense. Very erudite, you know. But that's about all. I mean, they don't have much beyond that. So, being a big Joyce fan, I really didn't see it myself when I read the recognitions. He was very adamant that he wasn't influenced by Joyce. In fact, he only read a little bit of it in college, the final Molly Bloom monologue, which is being passed around basically as pornography. So that was the extent of his. He did dip into a few the Dubliner stories, and I think he may have read The Portrait of the Artist, but no, Joyce he was a very well-read man. So he was familiar with most writers, but not Ulysses. He never got through that. And never regretted it too.
Never.
But it was enough to get me started, though. That's the main thing. Because of my Joyce fanaticism, and so that misunderstanding actually worked in my favor in one sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So how long was it after sort of really deeply engaging with Gaddis's work until you met the man himself? I
met him, I started reading him in 1975, read J.R. a few months after that, which convinced me this guy was a genius. I mean, to write one or the other of those would be enough, but to one man writing both novels like that, which are totally different, that sealed the deal for me. So I started working on the Reader's Guide, and long about 1978 or so, I wrote to Gaddis, and I told him I had, what I was doing, and asked some dumb questions about sources and stuff, which he pretty much ignored. He said, "You're pretty much on your own." That's what he told me. But then after my book came out, which he was very pleased with, he was delighted that someone went to that much trouble. I met him the year after that, 1983. I had to go to New York City for an MLA scholarly convention. And I told him I was coming out there, so he invited me over, and I met him at that point. And a very kind of almost aristocratic guy. He was very New England background, Harvard background, old school, always wore a tie, suit, very conventional looking, although he certainly wasn't a conventional thinker. He was a very nice guy. I can just leave it at that,
Mm-hmm. I mean, completely fine if you don't want to delve too much into this, but from all the biographical stuff that I've read, there's a sense that he was maybe a little bit demanding, or or perhaps I don't want to say overbearing, and I don't want to say domineering, but around that, as sort of a very sincere and erudite figure.
Yeah, he was only demanding when it regarded his work. He didn't have much patience for some of his editors who wanted to change things and all that, and so he was very concerned about that. Demanding, I don't know. His first marriage didn't go well because he was devoted to his work too much, his wife felt, which is probably a complaint a lot of writers' wives have. But beyond that, I don't know if he's that demanding. He certainly was a good father. He, as you know, he grew up without a father, so he seemed to deliberately make up for that, and he was a great father to his son and daughter. And he did kind of keep a arm's length from his critics. He felt that he did his work in writing his book, and then now they need to do their own work. He didn't want to help them out. He didn't feel it was his job to, help them and provide all the information they sometimes wanted. Mm-hmm. But no, he was a decent man. They say you shouldn't meet your heroes, but in one sense, he was a really decent man with a high sense of morals and ethics and all that. So. Yeah, I wasn't disappointed in him.
Mhm. Did you stay in touch? Did you sort of become friends, or was it an academic?
It was, yeah. We stayed in touch for about another 10 years or so. Yeah, I met him another time when I decided to get a PhD. I went back east to Rutgers University in New Jersey, and he invited me out to stay at his place in the Hamptons in Long Island for about 3 days. So it was nice, and we kept in contact with throughout the 80s, early 90s until right before his death. Yeah, it kind of faded during the 1990s, but yeah, we stayed in touch.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Well, maybe there'll be some sort of relevant anecdotes as we go to talk about his work. But I mean, I will open with I guess just a general question of as I mentioned at the start. I mean, maybe you would agree or disagree about if he is known, and I mean amongst the postmodernists is probably where he'd be placed, I guess, within literary history within its own context. I mean, people might put him amongst Pynchon, Foster Wallace, and these figures. Even though I often think that sort of when people say, "Oh, if you like Infinite Jest, go read Gravity's Rainbow," I think it's really once again this sort of Ulysses type thing of, well, you're just referencing another long, complicated book. That doesn't necessarily mean they're alike, but Gaddis, an American proto-postmodern thinker, if he is known, which out of that ilk, he's not as well known, it's primarily for the recognitions in JR. So how would you just describe Gaddis's work?
Well, they're dominated by dialogue. You use a lot more dialogue than most writers. He was mostly concerned about. There's a phrase in JR that keeps getting bandied about called "what America's all about," and it's often used satirically. Someone would be talking about waste management progress, and say, "Yeah, that's what America's all about." But that really was his concern. He was concerned about his country from an early age, that it wasn't what it should be. It's full of corruption, a lot of things going wrong, and he as basically a satirist, he wanted to point out the problems America was having in the hopes that it would cure itself, which is of course a ridiculous notion that only a young person would have. But he looked around the world and he just didn't like what he saw, and he wanted to improve it, and he was disappointed that people wouldn't improve it. As again, as naive as that sounds, but it's basically it was all about America. And in fact, I wonder if you would mind if I just read something that I wrote about 20 years ago. It'd only take about a minute.
Absolutely, yeah, sure.
This was for after he died, the magazine called Conjunctions gathered up a portfolio of people saying things about him. So here's what I wrote. The 4 cardinal points of any civilization are its art, economics, religion, and law. William Gaddis's great achievement was to apply cutting-edge fiction to a stringent analysis of these very points to define, quote, what America is all about, quote. So 1, art, both sacred and profane in the recognitions, a Gothic cathedral of a novel that still casts an enormous shadow over contemporary fiction. 2, economics in the acoustic collage JR, which satirized the abuses of capitalism in its day and even predicted the rot at the core of the junk bond 80s, the dot-com 90s, and the corporate scandals of our day. 3, religion in Carpenter's Gothic, exposing, quote, true believers, unquote, as the most dangerous and deluded people on earth. 4, and law in A Frolic of His Own, a code for conduct subverted to cover every form of misconduct. And as a coda, an opinion like those written by his own Judge Crease, Agape Agape, a final impassioned outburst summing up his half-century inquisition of American civilization. So that's kind of what his novels are basically an inquisition into American civilization and the ideals that we profess to have and that we don't actually follow. His wish that America could be everything it claims it is, and its national anthems and everything, and his disappointment that it didn't hold up to his own ideals, which leads to his. And then, of course, the older he got, he saw that the worse America was becoming, and he just finally gave up on the notion that America ever could be the land of the free and home of the brave that our national anthem claims it is. So that's Gaddis looking at American civilization. That's, I think, sums up what he was all about.
Mm-hmm. So I think I'm right in saying it was David Foster Wallace who said that Gaddis is the anomaly of I think he says postmodern writers because he only gets angrier over time, which is sort of a rarity. Usually these books get a bit softer around the edges, but Gaddis gets angrier, and I'd say all the way through to Frolic, eventually it gets almost silly, almost absurd by the end, this complete tangle of legality, and then with Agape is sort of this Bernhardian, an homage to a certain degree to Bernhard of an angry rant. Do you see any sort of progression through these works, or do you think they very much were clear cut in that art, economy, religion, law sense?
No, I think there is a progression from there's a certain amount of idealism in the recognitions where, again, he was young, he thought that America could right itself and et cetera, but then the older he got, they realized, and then of course in the 60s we had the Vietnam War, which he was against. The 70s you had Richard Nixon and all that stuff, and the older he got, his viewpoint just became darker and darker as he realized that the country would never be what it is. And it's also, a lot of people, as they grow older, they become more pessimistic. They're complaining about the good old days and how things aren't, the way they were. So that part of it, I think, is just part of growing up. I mean, I'm at age 72, and I'm certainly feeling that way. Look around at the world, just watch the news, and oh my God, I mean, it just makes you want to put your head in the oven. So part of it, part of it is just his disappointment that America wasn't what it should be.
What should it be?
Land of
the free, home of the brave, sort of.
Yeah, exactly. It should be equality, and there should be a lack of hatred. There shouldn't be any, no bigotry, no, equal rights for women and gays, and the ideal that you would think any civilization should have, but it's not that. Do
you think the world is as of yet to catch up to Gaddis? Because when I read JR, I mean, I still feel we haven't, technologically speaking, we seem ahead of it, and yet he still seems maybe one thing I would say to maybe draw a couple of questions in there together regarding his popularity is he not as popular as, say, Pynchon, DeLillo, Foster Wallace, is because we haven't really got to Gaddis yet, sadly speaking.
Yeah, there's a couple of things there. Gaddis is, I think, more sardonic and darker than the other two, Pynchon and Wallace, and some of those. And so there's that. A lot of people don't want to read dark, depressing works. Also, those two especially are a lot. They're kind of more fun to read. There's zanier and crazier and more into pop culture and all that. Whereas Gaddis wasn't. He's classical music. Those people are rock music. It's that kind of difference in tone and all that. And so that's one reason why that. And also, maybe there are others, but I think that's part of it. Gaddis is, once you get used to Gaddis, his humor and everything does come through, and it actually is kind of fun reading it. It's not fun, like the first time reading JR is a struggle to understand it, but once you get through it and you know what's going on, you can sit back and really enjoy it. But those first readings of his novels are a bit challenging, and which is not quite the same with, actually, a first reading of Gravity's Rainbow is very puzzling as well, or Infinite Jest, but there's enough surface, joking around and fun and puns and all that to, I think, keep the reader going. So, I can see that. Yeah, I think there is a slight difference. And the pessimism. Yeah, I mean, let me think. Pynchon, he's still... his last novel ends with a very, heartwarming scene about the importance of family and all that. You see some of that in the Pale. I mean, what's the Pale King? What's the last?
Pale King.
Yeah. There's certain positive things going on there, but then again you turn to Agape Agape, and it's just pure darkness. So I think that probably has something to do with it as well.
Well, I mean, outside of the obvious reason of it's difficult, why do you think? Because you're sort of known for reading long, difficult books. Why as readers do we have an aversion to difficult, complicated text? Which, to use sort of one of the infamous Gaddis reviews, if you take your eyes off the page for just one sentence, suddenly you don't know where you are. Books that demand our attention, we just don't really seem to want to do that.
Yeah, I think that's a heritage of the old sense of the novel being a kind of a middle class entertainment, for the bourgeois, which it was from the 18th century up to the early 20th century. But then, as some people would say, Joyce came along and ruined it all by trying to turn the novel into a high art, concept, like opera or something like that, classical music, which requires a certain amount of work. It's sitting down and listening to Wagner's Parsifal is requires a lot. It's difficult in one sense. You have to pay attention. You have to, it takes a lot of endurance to get through some of those, and that's what the novel, the art novel of the 20th century became. It was more difficult in many ways. And again, I think it goes back to some of us are attracted to, I would say, difficulty. It's challenging. That's the word Gaddis preferred to. Challenging works, just as a personal thing. I mean, I like, for example, I'm a huge fan of music too, and I like difficult music. And it's, you either have a taste for that sort of thing or you don't. But and a lot of people don't, because again, the novel is long been considered a form of entertainment, not a something you study. In fact, as you probably know, the novels weren't even a part of an English curriculum until maybe about 100 years ago. If you studied literature, you studied poetry and drama. The novel was not even considered worth studying. It was just a form of entertainment. Well, Joyce, after Joyce, a lot of people started taking after him, Faulkner and others, who wanted to make it high art, not just low entertainment. So, it's a personal choice. Some people like difficult things, challenging things, and some want to just relax with a easy to read novel. And then you have certain things like in between, like Don DeLillo. He's easy to read, even though he's got some intellectual things going on in them. But John Barth, again, a brilliant intellectual writer, but he can be kind of fun to read. But Gaddis, he tips into that area where it's more like, I don't know, Arno Schmidt or some one of these heavy experimental type writers, which I don't know what to say beyond that.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, in terms of the we mentioned those four themes there, art, economy, religion, law, do you think in relation to those four, which are these sort of cornerstones of what it is to be American, or what America is all about, as you said, do you think Gaddis utilized his infamous difficulty for a purpose outside of simply challenge? Is it there to possibly demand something typically American?
Well, one aspect of that is that with every topic he treated, he really dug into the foundations of it and did a lot of research and all that. So, for example, A Frolic of His Own, it's not just any kind of legal novel. It's not like a John Grisham courtroom type novel. He really did this enormous amount of research and got to understand the legal system, the citation systems, and all that. So it's much more difficult as a result, as a reading experience, because of the enormous amount of research he did into that, and into early religions and mythology and the recognitions and all that. And so that could be one of the reasons that every topic he approached, he really thoroughly dug into it, and he wanted to share his research in one sense which again makes the books a bit difficult, but that's just because he wanted to do it right. Yeah, his first job he got after he left Harvard in 1945 was as a fact checker for the New Yorker. So he was only there for a year and a half, but he admitted later in life that really had an influence on him, making sure you got the facts right, researching everything very closely, making sure you know exactly what you're talking about. And he conveys that in some of his books in a way that could be, challenging for some readers.
Mm-hmm. This actually brings me to a question I didn't note down, so I do apologize. But this question of communication, because communication with respect to this difficulty is sort of key in the sense of, I don't know, if we take something such as JR, you often have half of a phone conversation, you only have one side of a phone conversation. Or in Frolic of His Own, you suddenly turn the page and you're amidst, a legal report or even a play or something, some such sort of reminiscent in a way of like Moby Dick, where you're moving between styles. But Gaddis seems to utilize the forms of communication to sort of, throw you into almost like the technology of the day. I mean, with JR, the technology is phone calls. It seems to be that, that form of communication needed to make it into the book for him. Life isn't as clear cut as a one-to-one dialogue, of which he was undoubtedly a master. So I guess the question there is, I mean, what do you think communication is for Gaddis? Because it seems he's always, trying to make it clear that communication isn't this clear-cut thing that we would get in a Grisham novel.
Yeah. Boy, that's a tough one. First of all, he saw that as a model for the reader. If you're reading a book, you have to pay attention to what's going on, just the same way if you're having a conversation with someone, you have to pay really close attention to not only what they're saying, but what the underlying motives for what they're saying, and making sure you understand, you don't misunderstand people, which happens all the time. You tell a female colleague you want to maybe get together for coffee sometime, and that's all you mean, but she regards it as a sexual come-on, and suddenly you're in legal trouble. Your communication is not as clear as you would think it would be. And this, of course, you probably know, this is a great theme in Pynchon, too, with entropy and communication breakdowns and all that sort of thing. Our inability to really communicate thoroughly and honestly with each other is a problem, always been a problem, always will be, no matter what mode of technology we use. If Gaddis were alive today, it'd be, emails and, social messaging, that sort of thing. So, and how do we communicate? Yeah, it's always a problem. He liked the dialogue, though, because it seemed like the most vibrant way of putting that. Writers are always told to show rather than tell, and he loved the dialogue for the immediacy of it, and the fact that you expose a lot of your character and the kind of language you use. And he thought that language moved very quickly, and it dramatizes the problems we have in communication, where people, even in his novels, they misunderstand each other or get the words wrong. There's one point where one of the characters, JR, wants to talk to a colonel, MOIST. So Moist is a French name, apparently, in Africa. So he turns to his secretary and says, Virginia, get moist. And she says, what? So little things like that. He uses a lot of humorous things just to show how hard communication is, even when you're just using simple words. And that is one of the great challenges of being human, isn't it? Just communicating clearly with other people and to be understood too. There's nothing worse than being misunderstood by someone, especially when you're trying to be so clear. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of what it gets around to.
No, I think it definitely does. I mean, it reminds me of sort of how JR opens really with this sort of almost metatextual joke of the lawyer Cohen's name. You know, he's explicit
Oh, yeah.
that it's Cohen, and then immediately Anne, you know, you only know this. That she then says his name is Coen, but you as the reader are the only person who sees this this miscommunication that's happened and continues to happen, even though he's been explicit. And it's I don't know, reveals Gaddis's ability very quickly. And you soon realize why that book took 20 years to write.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you feel so you mentioned, you know, this idea that his work is about what is America all about, and I risk sort of repeating another question along the same lines here. But what do you think he sought to achieve? Do you believe he sought to achieve to show people, you know, what America could be and what it is becoming? Or, you know, was there not such an explicit, this is what I'm seeking to do?
Yeah, he never actually spelled out, as you asked a little while ago, about, you know, what would an ideal America look like? You know, because that he kind of felt that it's just the opposite of what it is now is how he'd answer. And I think in one sense there's another way of looking at this, is that Gaddis, every novel reflects Gaddis's age. You know, the first novel he wrote when he was like between 25 and 32, and it's a young man's book, a lot of viewpoint, a certain amount of optimism still a bit there, you know, hoping that if he, you know, pointed out society's ills, they would solve it. But then as he got older, he more revealed his point of view from in age 40s, 50s, when he wrote J.R., the darkening view, the tied down to a bad marriage, looking around him and seeing all sorts of things. And then Carpenter's Gothic is Gaddis at age 60, and then the final one, Frolic of His Own, is sort of Judge Crease is one of the main characters. He was in his late 80s, early 90s. And in every novel, Gaddis kind of looks at his own view. It's like taking a temperature at different ages of his viewpoint of the world. So in one sense, you could say that his novels are just about Gaddis, you know, dramatizing his worldview at various ages, various stages of his life. You can say, okay, here's an interesting person, well-read person, and here's how a well-educated, well-read person would register how the world looks to him at various ages. Now, I don't know if you could say that of other writers. If, you know, Pynchon, for example, shows his age in his novels, maybe so. Or Dickens or someone else. Well, maybe Dickens would be a good example, because he certainly got darker as he went along, didn't he? Hmm. So in one sense, that's it. It's just Gaddis giving different readings of his outlook at various points of his life as he grew older.
So you only mentioned the four there. In that sense of, you know, different views of life, what do you think Agape was? What did he intend that to be?
It's not a very. I have trouble with that book because it's not as good as it should have been, and not what he really meant. It started off as a work of nonfiction, then he struggled with that. Then he decided to turn it into a monologue after the model of Thomas Bernhard, as you mentioned earlier. He died before he could really finish it, so it's a final cry from the heart of how difficult it is to be a writer in today's society. He's surrounded by all these notes and everything. He's trying to pull it together, trying to pull a final novel together, doubting his own abilities, looking back on the younger person he was. There's some really touching stuff towards the end about he's sort of talking about the recognitions, the man he was when he wrote the recognitions, and how much he misses that person. He wishes he still had that person's energy and all that. And just a realization that he doesn't have that anymore, and it's just sort of a farewell, you know, to life, because he knew he was dying when he finished that book, and it was just, you know, a valedictory speech of a sort. But again, I don't want to get too much into it because I don't think he didn't complete it to his satisfaction, and it's the least appealing of his books. So, I have a whole chapter on it in my book. I tried to make the best case for it as I could, but it's the first four that he's going to be known for and celebrated for, I think, or not celebrated, known for.
Do you think he saw himself as successful with those four?
I'm sorry, what?
Do you think he saw himself as a successful writer with those four books? Do you think?
Yeah. Yeah, he always had doubts, but I think he was proud of those four books and the first four, and he was disappointed that he wasn't more financially successful. I mean, he did wish his books sold better and had a wider audience. He sometimes resented the fact that his main audience seemed to be made up of critics and literary professors, those kind of people. He wished he had a broader audience among the general public. But I think that's partly because, but on the other hand, I don't think he realized how challenging his books were to this general reader. So, when you're a very intelligent person, like he obviously is, you kind of sometimes lose sight of what the average reader is like, what they're used to. So I think he was a bit deluded in that sense. But so artistically, yeah, he was very happy. I think he's proud of his body of work, and especially when he saw how many people were writing books and dissertations about him and articles. He felt that he actually, accomplished something, but he did wish he was more commercially successful. I know that.
Mm-hmm. So just to turn back to his work sort of in itself, there's a couple of sort of broad themes that I want to tackle. One that's a bit more difficult than the other, but the first one is something already sort of had a little reference to, which is this notion of the absent father, which is biographically speaking, his father wasn't around, but throughout his books he seems to extend this notion of the absent father to, I mean, in the recognitions, it almost seems like almost everyone in the recognitions is at least crying out for like a metaphorical father, for something to guide them. And it seems to be a strain throughout his work of people in need of some authority, if you want to. I don't know if you'd agree with me on that one.
Yeah, and it. Let's see. A need for authority, more of a longing, a wish for authority that's not actually there. I'm sure you've noticed, Gaddis has a very dim view of, I want to say Christianity, but it's actually deism. Deism, this idea that there's a God who's watching over you and who's passed along his guidelines for living to various self-appointed prophets, and all you have to do is follow that. Well, Gaddis was kind of an atheist from an early age, and he realized that's not the way it works. Systems of morality and ethics were developed by humans, and there's no ultimate, absolute source for those. They're just people trying to decide what's the best way to live your life, which is a difficult decision to make for someone who doesn't believe in a God. You realize you can't you're not being handed a list of rules to follow like the Ten Commandments. You have to come up with not your own rules, but you have to search through various philosophical, ethical systems, find out which ones are, the most realistic, which are sound, which ones aren't, and try to make your own way. And so, yes, there's an absence of fathers in almost all of his novels, and I think it's one way of Gaddis's way of hinting that there is no, father that you can rely on. That all of us are basically, individuals who have to come to our own decisions and realize that. You have to come up with your own ethics, your own moral compass. You can't just accept one that's allegedly comes from God. So I think it's something like that, yeah. And the fact that he grew up without one, so he certainly knew what it was like in a biological sense. But I think it's ultimately, you just have to grow up. You have to realize you don't have a heavenly father, or in some cases, a literal father to guide you. You're on your own. You have to come up with your own systems and decide which ones are best, and then follow them.
So he didn't believe in God at all?
No. He from a pretty early age he was became an atheist, and just that even became even hardened in him as he grew older and older. One of his last essays was written in 1994 or so, called "Old Foes with New Faces," which is his most damning attack on religion that I think he ever wrote. But he was an atheist. Yeah, it's no.
He seems to retain like a deep interest, however, in I guess, in the recognitions you have sort of the dialogue in a way between Catholicism, Protestantism, and then you also have this strange, I'm completely forgetting the name of Mithraism, finally sort of burgeoning its head later on in the novel. It almost seems like there's a strange strain of Gnosticism that we're sort of held in a not so nice world, and we just need to figure it out by ourselves. But in this sense, there's no divine spark. That's quite terrifying. It is very pessimistic.
Yeah, there's a modicum of sympathy for some of the Catholic characters in the recognitions. Like there's a character named Stanley, the organist, and there's a Father Martin who gives some guidance to Stanley late in the novel. So, but because they're ethical people. I mean, Stanley especially is like one of the nicest characters, but in that whole novel. But for him, religion is like a weight on him. It doesn't bring any joy to his life. It's just, and in fact, as you know, the novel ends with him playing a mass for his dead mother, and this Italian church collapses on him. His religion literally kills him. And there's another character in the same near the end, Esme, who dies from I think kissing a statue of a saint or something. So in the recognitions, religion is actually lethal for a couple of characters. And then, of course, in Carpenter's Gothic is where he it was written at the period in America where you held all these televangelists, and the worst kind of Christianity, the most fundamentalist, uneducated forms of Christianity were rampant in America, which drove him crazy. So, I don't know where we started on this, but his atheism is another thing that just darkened as he got older. And again, it comes back to this. There's several famous, was it Voltaire said that there isn't a God. It'd be necessary to exist to create one. And Wehinger had this whole idea of the philosophy of as if. We should act as if there were a God. There's this yearning for some kind of absolute that we can pin our ethical systems on, which is felt by many of his Gaddis's characters, but the ultimate realization is, there is no ultimate authority. There is no God. Philosophical, ethical systems are human inventions, and some are better than others. And our main job, the job of any mature intellectual, is to sort them out, which ethical systems are the best, and try to live by them. Especially when you're surrounded in a country with people living other ethical, what so-called moral systems that are, uninformed, whether it's white supremacism or bigotry or whatever, racism. I'm sure those people feel they're quite moral when they're, opposing abortion rights and that kind of stuff. But so you have to. It's a certain amount of work sorting out which ethical systems are the best, and that's work, and a lot of people don't want that work. They want to just simply rely on the religion that they were raised under. And go back to reading simple novels and having a simple life and avoiding all the difficulties that Gaddis is very much exemplifies in his work.
There's sort of a strange irony there, because we both you mentioned Gaddis as a pessimist, and the fact that this absent father. You can't rely on, an ultimate God, an ultimate authority figure. You have to work it out for yourself. But it seems I've never seen Gaddis referred to as a nihilist. Would you think that would be an incorrect view to have, that his work is nihilistic?
Yeah, I think that would be going too far. He has a line, I think in J.R. he quotes a line that Beethoven used. So the best among us must bear each other in mind. And there's another similar statement made by Flaubert about that, how the way you get through life is to identify other people who not simply think like you, but who have reached the same point you have on morals and ethics, and you take some comfort from them and share those feelings. You find a small group of people that share your worldview and make sure it's a positive one, of course. And you let that's what sustains you. That's what keeps you alive. The fact that there's some great works of literature that you can read, great works of music, good friends, all that. He did have those. He had friends. He enjoyed music, and he loved reading books, obviously. And he had his very proud of his son and daughter. So you take comfort where you can find it. Yeah, a nihilist would just say there's none of that exists at all. There's not, And so he never went that far. No, he never went over the edge like that.
There's this notion of systems as well. I mean, as something that might possibly replace the authority we were, as you said, longing for. With J.R., we see, the economy, we see this sort of burgeoning industry built by, how old is J.R.? I think he's 10. Is he 10? This 10-year-old boy creating this massive sort of systematic, well, I think in one interview, Gaddis says early Reaganite sort of business. And then, of course, in Frolic of His Own, we see the same sort of thing in terms of systems with this, these different legal cases and eventually intertwining into something which almost appears as a system which is replacing that figure. Like we can rely on these systems. That's the thing we sort of lean on now for guidance.
Yeah, and so many of those systems are corrupt, aren't they? I mean, certainly the business world doesn't work the way, it's just greed, basically. The legal system we have is tries to make sense of the world, but the legal system is misused by so many people who are corrupt lawyers and people who are trying to just use the legal system to get back at people or to avoid responsibility for something. So, yeah, we do have these systems, but very few of them seem to work very well. Educational system, he complains about that, how it's not really working. So what do you do? I mean, you're right. I mean, in one sense, it's we've replaced theology with these earthly systems, but they aren't much better because there's some basic problems with greed and that run throughout all of those. Money, people just want to make money, and then that's one of the fine thing. One of the great things about choosing a 10-year-old boy or 11-year-old boy, J.R., as his main character, because J.R. doesn't question any of these things. All of Gaddis's other adult protagonists look around the world and they don't like it and they want to change it. J.R. just looks around and sees, okay, this is the world I'm born in. Where do I get mine? How do I make money? How do I take? There's no sense of morality with him. This is just he takes the world, he sees the world as it is, and just takes advantage of it. And I think Gaddis really, I think Donald Trump is that kind of character. He doesn't have a moral or ethical bone in his body. He just, as an early age, I think he just saw the world the way it is, and says, okay, I'm going to get as much money out of this as I can, and that's it. There's no self-questioning and all that. If all you have are just these tottering systems that they mean well. I mean, the legal code is supposed to is there to keep order, of course. Mm-hmm. And so the education system, all these other systems we have, they're they mean well, but you've got human beings though who infiltrate it and just kind of corrupt them and take advantage of them and render them render them void. I mean, capitalism is a fine way of running an economy, but then you have a lot of these people who just take advantage of capitalism just to gouge people, to make as much money as they can, to take advantage of others, and that what do you do? What do you do with that?
Mm-hmm. And much like JR, it all falls down. Thousands of lives are ruined, and then you just start it all up again.
Yeah. That's Gaddis was insistent on that point that JR is not an attack on capitalism per se, but the misuse of capitalism. The all the tax avoidance schemes and all that kind of stuff that fills that novel. Same with the legal system. It's the misuse of the legal system that is at the heart of Frolic of His Own. Even the misuse of religion. I mean, if you looked upon religion simply as a moral, ethical system, with the golden rule at the heart of it, treat other people the way you want to treat yourself, that's fine. That would be great. But it's the misuse of religion that he was on against in many of his novels. So it's one thing to come up with systems, but it's another thing to come up with honest people that'll use those systems the way they were intended.
So Gaddis is often called a writer's writer. I mean, where might we most directly see his influence today?
Well, there's a long line of writers who seem to have been influenced by him or admired him almost from the very beginning. Have you ever looked at online? There's this thing called the Gaddis Annotations website. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a page there called Gaddis in Fiction, which lists about, 24, maybe 36 works in which Gaddis actually kind of appears as a character or shows a great influence on the writers. And I think these are all writers who appreciated what Gaddis was doing, so they actually worked him into their own novels, starting way back in the early 60s with David Markson, and then Joseph McElroy, Harry Matthews. All these people were aware of Gaddis and actually make little references to him in their own works. And I think ever since then, to this day, I think he's probably got more fans among writers than he does. Well, I can't say that, but a lot of writers really appreciate him for what he did and what he was doing. And and Gaddis was writing for people who understood the challenges and of literature or literary writing, and I think that's why they admire what they read him and they think, wow, I wish I could do that. I mean, how many people would love to try to write a 700-page novel all in dialogue, but wouldn't dare do it? I mean, you have to be they could try, but that he was able to do things like that, all these superhuman accomplishments of his, to write legal briefs the way he did Frolic of His Own. I mean, if you're a talented writer, you might be able to pull off one or two of those, but he's got a half dozen or a dozen of them in there, and all sorts of depositions and everything. I mean, that's I think writers appreciate that more than most people.
Mm-hmm. How has Gaddis's work affect your own life, influenced your own life?
Well, if I hadn't discovered Gaddis, I don't know what I would have done with most of my life. Let me think. Well, it was just a topic for writing for me. Obviously, I mean, it's something I identified with him so much when I read the recognitions. I liked his attitude towards the world. I liked the sardonic writing. The fact that he was a young man trying to make sense of the world, as I was, as most of us are when we're in our 20s. The novel was filled, at that point, in addition to reading a lot of literature, I'm talking when I was like 25, 20, I was reading a lot of books on the origins of religion and mythology, books like Fraser's Golden Bough and Robert Graves' White Goddess, things like that. And there, in the pages of recognitions, there's Fraser and Graves being actually quoted. There's a whole paragraph from Golden Bough right there in the first chapter of the recognitions. So that just was right in my wheelhouse, as they say. He was interested in the same things I was. I liked his attitude. The language was extraordinary, So I just, that's the most naive way of approaching a novel, saying, well, I can really identify with the characters, but in fact, that did appeal to me, and that was part of why I found his work so inviting and kept writing about him, because I shared his moral outlook, I shared his religious or anti-religious outlook, his viewpoint on various things. So, yeah, he was. I won't say he was a guide for me. I mean, I didn't regard him quite that way, but it's just someone I really identified with, and that kept me after him. In a way I wouldn't have if I had writing about Henry James or someone. I don't think there's no identification there, but with Gaddis, that really helped fuel my enthusiasm for him and kept it going.
Mm-hmm. Where would you advise new readers to begin with his work?
Well, I guess the obvious one would be Carpenter's Gothic. Even though it's a very dark novel, it's short, and it does display his abilities with conversation. It's good, maybe 50% of it, probably 70% of it is in dialogue. There's also a lot of nature writing, long descriptive sentences of the season, which is fall, and the gardenings and flowers falling and stuff. There's a lot of really great descriptive writing in there. And it's an easy plot to follow, unlike the more complicated other ones. It all takes place basically in one house. So it's easiest of his to read, and it has all of his major themes in it, basically. It's all in kind of abbreviated form, but that would be the obvious one to read, yeah. Mm-hmm. Even though, like I said, it's a bit more, it's not as much fun and zaniness as there is in J.R., for example, or Frolic of His Own, but there's some humor, and that. So with that one exception, I think that'd probably be the one to go to.
Mm. And what advice might you give to those who are tackling J.R.? Because that's become an infamous novel of difficulty.
Yeah, well, I would first send them back to that Gaddis Annotations website, because that has I have a document on there where I give little plot summaries of every episode of the book. So there's a little plot summaries there, as well as annotations for his various references and stuff. So if you have that on hand, you can make your way through it. In fact, Dave Wallace used that. When he wanted to teach J.R. when we were both living in Normal, Illinois. That's where Dalkey Archive was, and he was teaching at Illinois State University, and he wanted to teach the thing. So he asked me to print that out for him personally, so he could use it for his class, so that he could make his own way through the novel as well as his classmates, his students. So, it'd be ideally you would just read the novel through by yourself with taking as few breaks as possible, because there are no chapter breaks. And that's the way to read it, but that's really kind of difficult to do. So, there are now tools for reading that. So I would push someone in that direction.
Is there anything you'd like to add about Gaddis or his work that you'd like to add into this conversation?
Not really. You mentioned something about postmodernism, and I think that's another, like Ulysses, that's a kind of a false comparison. I think Gaddis became a postmodernist almost by default from critics, because in the 70s, when that really became a thing, Gaddis was associated with people like John Barth, Coover, Pynchon, some of the others, Stanley Yelkin, Barthelme. And since most of those were called postmodernists, Gaddis sort of by default was called one, but he didn't see himself that way at all. He was more, if anything, a modernist. He was raised with the generation of writers like Evelyn Waugh, Joseph Conrad, Ronald Furbank. I don't know if you know his work, but he's a huge influence for Gaddis's use of dialogue. T.S. Eliot, of course. In fact, I sometimes suspect that a lot of the erudition and recognitions was inspired by T.S. Eliot's notes to The Wasteland. That combination of erudition and poetry, I think, may have appealed to Gaddis, because he revered T.S. Eliot. That's one other complication about Gaddis's attitude towards religion. Even though he's an atheist, he, like I said, revered T.S. Eliot. He loved, above all, Dostoevsky, of course, who was obsessed by religion. And and then, in fact, that's another thing. Dostoevsky, the greatest influences on Gaddis were the 19th century Russian novelists. That's who he really felt that he learned everything from, and he shares their moral concerns. Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Gogol, of course, the guy that wrote Dead Souls. Gaddis's favorite novel of all time, he said, was Oblomov by Gontarov. I think that's how you pronounce his name. So that's one thing that's been overlooked, the influence of Russian literature on Gaddis. That's what made him, and that puts him even at a further distance from 20th century postmodernism. So yeah, he's associated with that group, but really had nothing in common rather than just socially. I mean, he met a lot of those people and got along with them, but that's about all.
You recently, I think is it your most recent piece of scholarship on Gaddis was a piece on Gaddis in relation to Russian literature.
Yeah, actually I did. Earlier this year. There's a Russian publisher who's bringing out a translation of my 2015 book on Gaddis. So they asked me to write a little preface. So I thought I'd write a little thing about how much Gaddis loved and was influenced by Russian literature, which they loved, and they're going to be translating that as part of the book. So then I decided, well, I might as well publish it somewhere, and I found someone that did. But it's only about 5 or 6 pages long. It's a topic that really needs like a book could be written on it. Actually, I mean, there's almost enough material. But yeah, I took a first swing at it, and hopefully that'll be taken up by other scholars later. Mm-hmm. So what do you? I sort of feel I'm at the end of my writing career myself, so I don't plan on doing anything that elaborate in the future. I've been able to squeak out a few shorter things, but I think it's time to hang up the gloves.
I was going to ask if you were working on anything now, but I understand. I think it was 2018. They published the 2 very large volumes on the history of the novel. So. I mean, that's quite a feat.
Yeah, that took a lot out of me, and and then I gathered up all my various essays and book reviews over the years to, in a book called My Back Pages, which is named after a Bob Dylan song. So that's kind of wrapping up my career, and I'll continue maybe writing little things as they occur to me. In fact, just about a year ago, I had a sudden yearn to write a little memoir of my days at Dalkey Archive Press, which was just published last April. But so there's maybe a few spur-of-the-moment things left in me, but I'm certainly not planning any major works or certainly no books from this point on.
And all your information about your own work can be found at your site, which is, what's your website again?
It's stephenmoore.info.
I'll be sure to put links for that and your own books in the description below, but unless there's anything you'd like to add, Steve, I think that's a good place to finish up.
Nope. I'm just glad to see that there's this kind of continuing interest in Gaddis from people like you, especially younger critics. Often after a novelist dies, people lose interest in them, and that doesn't seem to be the case for Gaddis. His first 2 novels were recently reprinted by New York Review Books, and this seems to be going strong, and I'm really pleased to see that, and pleased in your interest in him as well.
Well, I mean, he's become a second job. It's like an obsession to try understand everything that's there. I mean, one novel could, at least one of the big 2, could last you a lifetime in a way.
Yeah, it could.
Well, Steve, I mean, it's been a great conversation. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you.